The letter sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I opened it. Not because I was afraid of it. I just knew what was inside, and I wanted to be in the right headspace before I read it. When your name's been in a town's records for 61 years, and not just your name, your family's name, your grandfather's name, you learn to read the energy before you read the words. I finally opened it on a Thursday morning, coffee in hand, rain on the window. Dear Mr. Calloway, the town of Maron Crossing hereby provides formal notice that pursuant to Chapter 12, Section 4 of the Municipal Land Use Code, the storage yard located at 140 Birch Hollow Road has been designated for public acquisition under eminent domain proceedings. I set the letter down, picked up my coffee, looked out at the yard. 14 acres of flat gravel and low-slope sheds, tucked behind a tree line on the east edge of town. 6,000 square feet of covered storage. 4 loading bays, and 2 rail spurs that connected, through a junction 2 miles north, to the Norfolk Southern Main Line running through the heart of Maron Crossing. The town wanted the land. What they did not mention, what I suspected they had not fully thought through, was what was sitting on it. My name is Dale Calloway. I am 63 years old. For the last 22 years I have operated Calloway Industrial Storage, a private freight staging and short-haul rail yard. We are not flashy. No website, no social media, no sign on the highway. My clients find me through other clients. I move industrial equipment, heavy materials, and oversized freight that does not fit standard logistics. And I have done it quietly, without disruption, without debt, without drama. I have also paid my property taxes every year since 1994, not once late. The town council had apparently decided that 14 acres of prime commercial land near the expanding Eastern Corridor was worth more in their hands than mine. The letter cited a public infrastructure initiative and offered me a buyout figure that was, by my rough estimate, about 40% below market. I read the letter a second time. Then a third. There was a name at the bottom. Councilwoman Patricia Dren, chair of the Land Use Committee. I did not know her well. She had been elected 2 cycles ago, came from real estate development, had a reputation for moving fast and asking forgiveness later. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. Then I walked out to the yard, crunched across the gravel in the morning quiet, and stood at the end of the eastern rail spur. The tracks ran straight, rust-edged but solid, disappearing into the tree line. They were my tracks. But they were not just mine, and that was a distinction Patricia Dren was about to find very inconvenient. I should explain what those tracks actually mean, not just to me, but to this town. Back in 1963, my grandfather Edwin Calloway purchased the Birch Hollow property from a timber company that had gone under. The land came with something most buyers would not have noticed or cared about: a private rail easement, and 2 functional spur lines connecting to what was then the Southern Railway corridor. Grandfather Edwin was a practical man. He saw the spurs not as a curiosity, but as infrastructure. He started using the property for equipment storage almost immediately. When my father took over in the 80s, he formalized the operation. Calloway Industrial Storage became a licensed private freight facility. We were never big, never tried to be. But we were useful in a specific, hard-to-replace way. Here is what most people in Maron Crossing did not know, and what I suspected Councilwoman Dren had completely missed when she decided to target my property. Those 2 rail spurs were not decorative, they were active. And they were not just connected to the main line. Per a 1974 agreement between my father and the railway, the Calloway spurs served as the designated emergency rerouting path for freight movement through the Eastern Corridor whenever the primary junction at Maron Crossing Station required maintenance or experienced delays. In plain language, if the town's main rail junction ever went down, freight rerouted through my yard. That happened, on average, 4 to 6 times a year. The agreement had been renewed quietly, paperwork to paperwork, for 5 decades. It did not make headlines. Nobody held a ceremony. It just sat in a filing cabinet in my office and in the records of what was now Norfolk Southern, doing its job without anyone paying attention. I had a copy. Norfolk Southern had a copy. And this was the part that mattered. The agreement included a clause that any transfer or acquisition of the Calloway property required 60 days written notice to the railway and their formal approval before any change in operational status could take effect. The town's eminent domain letter contained no such notice, which meant either Dren's committee had researched the property thoroughly and decided to ignore this, or, more likely, I thought they had pulled the parcel records, seen 14 acres of gravel and sheds owned by one private individual, and assumed it was simple. Simple was not a word I would use to describe my situation. I went back inside, opened my filing cabinet, and pulled the 1974 agreement. 14 pages. Yellowed at the edges, signatures from men who had been dead for 20 years. Still valid, still binding. I read through it carefully, the way you read something when you are looking for either a problem or a weapon. I found the weapon on page 9. I did not call a lawyer that day. I did not call the council. I did not call anyone. I just made a pot of coffee and started taking notes. Patricia Dren held her public meetings on the second Tuesday of every month, in the main chamber of the Marin Crossing Municipal Building. I would been to 2 or 3 over the years: zoning questions, a drainage dispute that affected the East Side properties. Nothing major. I would always sat in the back, listened, left when my concern was addressed. I went to the next one. Not to speak. Not yet. I just wanted to watch her work. The chamber held maybe 80 people comfortably. That night there were about 30. Dren sat at the center of the council table, 5 members. But she ran the room. Mid-50s, sharp blazer, reading glasses she kept taking on and off for effect. She had the energy of someone who genuinely believed she was improving things. That was the part that made her dangerous. She was not corrupt in the obvious way. She was convinced. The infrastructure initiative she was pushing, the one my property was apparently central to, was called the Eastern Corridor Revitalization Plan. There was a slide deck, renderings of a mixed-use development with green spaces and a pedestrian path. The storage yard on the rendering was labeled simply Phase 1 Acquisition Site. Like I was not there. Like it was already done. A few residents asked questions. Dren answered them smoothly, confidently. She mentioned fair compensation. She mentioned community benefit. She used the phrase highest and best use twice. That is a real estate term. It means, what makes us the most money is not you. I watched her the whole time. When the public comment period opened, I did not stand up. The man next to me, retired, I think, flannel shirt, leaned over and whispered, "You are the storage yard fellow, are not you?" I nodded. He shook his head slowly, like he was at a funeral. After the meeting, I waited until most people had filtered out. Dren was near the door, talking to a younger staff member, when she noticed me standing by the back wall. She walked over with the practiced ease of someone who has had 100 uncomfortable conversations and learned to control them all. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Not a question. She knew exactly who I was. Councilwoman. "I hope you received our notice. We are very committed to making this transition fair for you." I looked at her for a moment. I did receive it. She waited for more. I did not give her more. "Well," she said, adjusting her glasses, "my office is always open if you want to discuss the valuation process." "I appreciate that," I said. "I will be in touch." I walked out into the cold parking lot. She thought that conversation had gone well for her. I could tell by the way she turned back to her staff member before I would even reach my truck. That was fine. I needed her to stay comfortable a little while longer. The first call I made was not to a lawyer. It was to a man named Roland Speck. Roland had worked for Southern Railway and then Norfolk Southern after the merger for 34 years. He retired as a regional operations coordinator, which sounds bureaucratic until you understand what it actually means. Roland knew every active agreement, every easement, every private spur arrangement in a 4-state corridor. He kept files the way some men keep fishing lures, organized, obsessive, and ready to deploy at a moment's notice. He also happened to be my father's oldest friend. I drove out to his place on a Saturday morning. He lived 20 minutes east of town, small house, big workshop, a quarter-mile of decorative track in his backyard that he ran a miniature locomotive on during good weather. I always liked that about him. Man spent his career moving freight across the eastern seaboard, retired, and decided what he really wanted was a smaller version of the same thing. He already had coffee ready when I pulled up. I would called ahead. Told him I needed to look at something. I laid the 1974 agreement on his workbench. He did not say anything for a few minutes. Just read. Turned pages. Went back to page 3, then forward to page 9, the clause I would flagged. "They send Norfolk Southern a notice?" he asked. "Not that I have seen." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Dale, this agreement is still live. I can check the current registry, but I would bet my pension it is in there. Your father renewed it in '89 and again in 2003. I was there for the second one. I know. Does the council know? I do not think they looked hard enough to find it. Roland set the pages down and looked at me over the rim of his coffee mug. You know what happens if they proceed without railway notification and approval? Tell me in your words. Any acquisition action is procedurally void until the railway signs off. Norfolk Southern has operational interest in that property. You cannot transfer title, you cannot change use, you cannot break ground on anything without their clearance. And they will not give clearance fast. That process takes months minimum, could stretch to a year if there are rerouting concerns. I nodded slowly. There is more, Roland said. He tapped page 11. This indemnification clause. If any acquiring party disrupts the operational capacity of those spurs without approved alternative routing in place, they are liable for operational losses. He let that sit. What kind of numbers are we talking? I asked. Roland leaned back. Depends on how many rerouting events occur during the disruption period. 4 to 6 a year, you said? Norfolk Southern standard loss calculation for a missed rerouting event on a freight corridor like this. He whistled quietly. It adds up fast. We are not talking parking tickets, Dale. I picked up the agreement and folded it carefully. I need to find out who Norfolk Southern's current regional counsel is, I said. Roland smiled for the first time. I might know a number. Roland gave me 2 numbers. One for the regional counsel's office in Charlotte, one for a logistics compliance manager named Teresa Wan, who, according to Roland, was the person who actually got things done when legal moved slowly. I called Teresa first. She answered on the second ring, which surprised me. I introduced myself, explained the property situation in plain terms, and told her I had the 1974 agreement in front of me and believed the town had initiated acquisition proceedings without railway notification. There was a pause on her end, not a long one. Can you scan and send me the agreement today? She said. Yes. And you have documentation of the municipal notice dates, reference numbers? I have the original letter. Another pause. Shorter this time. Mr. Calloway, I am going to pull our internal records on the Birch Hollow spur this afternoon. If what you are describing is accurate, this is a compliance issue on the municipality's side, not ours. But I want to verify our end before I say anything definitive. I understand. Give me until Wednesday. She called back Tuesday. The agreement was in their active registry, exactly as Roland had said. The Birch Hollow spurs were logged as operational emergency rerouting infrastructure. The notification requirement was binding, and this was the part Teresa said with a careful flatness that told me she would already run it past someone in legal. The town of Marin Crossing had filed 0 documentation with Norfolk Southern regarding the acquisition. We will be sending a formal notice to the municipality, she said, informing them of the existing agreement and the procedural requirements. How long does their compliance window open for? We give them 60 days to respond with a rerouting proposal or an operational impact assessment. If they cannot provide one, and building an alternative rerouting path for a corridor like this is not simple, the acquisition timeline stalls indefinitely. And if they try to proceed anyway? Teresa's voice stayed level. Then they are in breach of a federal rail operations agreement, and we pursue accordingly. That is not a municipal code issue anymore. That is a different conversation entirely. I thanked her. She told me to expect a copy of the railway's notice to the town within 10 business days. I hung up and sat quietly in my office for a while. Outside, one of my loaders was moving a flatbed into Bay 3. Normal afternoon, normal sounds. The kind of ordinary that you do not notice until someone tries to take it from you, and then suddenly it is the only thing you can hear. I had not filed anything. I had not hired anyone. I had not raised my voice or sent a single hostile letter. I would made 2 phone calls and read a document that had been sitting in my filing cabinet for 20 years. And somewhere in Charlotte, a compliance manager was drafting a letter that was about to land on Patricia Dren's desk like a piece of the ceiling. I still did not call a lawyer. Not yet. There was one more thing I wanted to understand first. The thing I wanted to understand was the development plan itself. Not the slide deck version Dren showed at the public meeting, the polished rendering with the green spaces and the pedestrian path. I wanted the actual plan, the one with numbers, timelines, and names attached. Municipal documents are public record. Most people do not know that, or do not bother. But a formal infrastructure initiative of this size, one that involved eminent domain proceedings, required filed documentation with the county planning office, application, environmental review request, preliminary survey, project timeline, and a list of interested parties. I drove to the county office on a Wednesday morning and asked the clerk for the Maron Crossing Eastern Corridor revitalization file. She found it in 12 minutes. I sat at a reading table for 2 hours with a legal pad and went through the whole thing. The project was more developed than I would realized. Survey work had already been done on 3 of the 4 parcels involved. Mine was the largest and listed as the anchor acquisition. Without it, the other 3 parcels did not create a contiguous development footprint. The whole plan depended on my 14 acres. That was the first thing I noted. The second was the developer. A company called Drenfield Partners LLC had been listed as the preferred development partner for the project. They would submitted a letter of intent 8 months ago, 4 months before the town sent me any notice at all. Drenfield Partners. I looked at that name for a long time. I am not a man who jumps to conclusions. I wrote it down, circled it, and kept reading. The third thing I noted was the timeline. The town had set an internal target of completing all acquisitions within 14 months to qualify for a state infrastructure grant. The grant had a hard deadline. If acquisitions were not complete by that date, the funding evaporated. They were already 6 months in, which meant they had 8 months left, and Norfolk Southern's compliance process alone could eat most of that. I sat back and looked at my notes. 3 facts, each one uncomfortable on its own. Together, they told a story I had not expected when I opened that letter on a Thursday morning. This was not just a town making a clumsy land grab. There was a developer with a name too similar to the councilwoman's to be comfortable, a grant deadline creating pressure to move fast, and a procedural error that could blow the entire timeline. I did not know yet whether Drenfield Partners had any formal connection to Patricia Dren. That was a factual question, and I was not going to assume the answer. But I was going to find it. I photographed every page in the file, thanked the clerk, and drove home. That evening I called my accountant, who referred me to a business records researcher he would used before. A woman named Claire who charged by the hour and did not ask unnecessary questions. I gave her one assignment: find out everything legally documented about Drenfield Partners LLC. Claire came back to me in 4 days. She was thorough. 8 pages, single-spaced, organized by source. Incorporation documents, registered agent filings, state business registry records, and 2 news mentions from a regional business journal. I read the whole thing at my kitchen table with the overhead light on, and the house quiet. Drenfield Partners LLC was incorporated 3 years ago in the state. 2 managing members listed. The first was a commercial developer named Marcus Holt, established, mid-sized operation, nothing unusual. The second managing member was listed as Patricia A. Dren. Not a relative, not a coincidence of names. Patricia Dren, the same woman chairing the Land Use Committee that had initiated eminent domain proceedings against my property. The same woman who had told me, to my face, that her office was committed to making the transition fair for me. I set the papers down. I want to be careful here about how I describe what I felt in that moment, because it was not rage. It was not even surprise, not entirely. It was something quieter and more clarifying, the feeling of a picture coming into focus after you have been squinting at it for too long. She had not just targeted my land because it was useful to the town. She would targeted it because it was useful to her. The eminent domain process would acquire my property at a suppressed valuation, that 40% below market figure from the original letter. The town would then transfer development rights to the preferred partner, to Drenfield Partners, to her company. I did not have a law degree, but I knew enough to know that a sitting council member using her public position to initiate acquisition of private property that would then benefit a company she personally owned was not a zoning dispute. That was something else entirely. I called Claire back. Is there anything in the public record connecting Dren's council role to her involvement in Drenfield? I asked. Nothing disclosed, Claire said. She's not listed on any conflict of interest filings with the municipality. Her financial disclosure forms reference investment holdings, but not the LLC directly. Is that a required disclosure in this state? For a council member involved in land use decisions. Yes, it is required. I wrote that down and underlined it twice. One more thing, Claire said. The Business Journal mention from about 18 months ago. There is a brief item about Drenfield Partners acquiring a site in a neighboring county. The quote from Holt mentions the firm is pursuing several municipal partnership opportunities in the region. Send me that article. She emailed it within the hour. I read it once, filed it with the rest of Claire's report, and put the whole package in a manila folder. Then I sat back and thought carefully about what I was holding. Because this had changed. What started as a fight to keep my property had become something that required a different kind of attention. And a different kind of help. I finally called a lawyer. Her name was Judith Crane. She would spent 12 years as a municipal attorney before going into private practice, which meant she understood exactly how these processes worked from the inside. My accountant recommended her. When I called, her assistant told me she had a 2-week waiting list. I mentioned the words eminent domain, active railway agreement, and undisclosed conflict of interest in the same sentence. She had an opening the following morning. I brought everything. The 1974 agreement. The municipal notice, the county planning file photographs, Claire's business records report, the Business Journal article, Roland's verbal account, which I would written up as a summary with dates and his contact information. Judith read through it methodically, the way I imagined she would read through hundreds of case files over the years. She did not react dramatically. She asked 4 questions, all of them precise, and wrote the answers in a notebook. When she finished, she took her glasses off and set them on the desk. The railway agreement issue alone is enough to stall the acquisition, she said. Norfolk Southern's notice to the municipality will create a procedural freeze. They cannot move forward without resolving that, and resolving it realistically takes longer than their grant window allows. So the timeline collapses. Very likely, yes. Without your parcel, they do not have a viable development footprint, and without the grant they probably do not have financing for the full project. I nodded. And the other part? Judith was quiet for a moment. The conflict of interest issue is serious. If Dren is a managing member of Drenfield Partners and failed to disclose that relationship while actively chairing the committee that initiated eminent domain proceedings benefiting that company, that is not a procedural oversight. That is a violation of municipal ethics code at minimum, potentially more, depending on how directly the acquisition was structured to benefit her financially. What does potentially more mean? It means if there is evidence of intentional concealment, you are in territory that involves the State Ethics Commission and possibly the County Prosecutor's Office. She paused. I want to be precise here. We do not file criminal allegations. We document what is in the public record, file the appropriate ethics complaint, and let the relevant authorities determine what it rises to. That is fine, I said. I am not interested in exaggerating anything. I am interested in accuracy. She looked at me for a moment. Good. That is exactly the right approach. We talked for another hour. She outlined a 2-track strategy. First, a formal legal response to the eminent domain notice challenging procedural validity based on the railway agreement. Second, a documented ethics complaint filed with the State Municipal Ethics Commission supported entirely by public records. No leaks to the press. No dramatic public statements. Just paperwork, filed in the right places, through the right channels. How long before any of this produces a result? I asked. The railway issue could freeze things within 30 days. The ethics complaint, that moves slower. Months, not weeks. I can be patient, I said. Judith almost smiled. I had a feeling. The Norfolk Southern notice arrived at the Maron Crossing Municipal Building on a Tuesday, 17 days after my call with Teresa Wan. I know the exact day because Judith called me that afternoon. They received it this morning, she said. I have a contact in the county clerk's office who confirmed it was logged into the municipal correspondence system at 9:47 AT7 AT. Any reaction yet? Too early, but I would expect something within the week. I went back to work. That is the part of this story that does not make for dramatic telling but matters more than people realize. While all of this was moving through channels and offices and legal processes, I still had a business to run. Clients with freight that needed staging, equipment that needed maintenance. Staff who showed up every morning expecting things to function normally. I kept it normal. 3 days after the railway notice landed, I got a call from Dren's office. Not from Dren herself, from a staff member named Kevin, who had the careful, overworked voice of someone delivering a message he did not write. Councilwoman Dren wanted to reach out and see if you would be available for a meeting to discuss the acquisition process. She feels a direct conversation might help clarify a few things. What kind of things? I asked. A pause. The timeline. And some questions that have come up internally. I will bet questions had come up internally. I am available Thursday afternoon, I said. 2:00. Perfect. Her office at the municipal building. My office, I said. Here at the property. Another pause. Longer this time. I will confirm that with her and call you back. He called back 20 minutes later. Thursday at 2 was fine. I told Judith. She advised me to keep the conversation factual, non-committal, and short. Record it if my state's laws allowed. They did. Single-party consent. Do not offer information. Let her talk. She is coming to assess what you know, Judith said. Not to negotiate. I know. Thursday came grey and cold. Dren arrived in a town vehicle, alone, which surprised me slightly. No staff. I would expected Kevin at minimum. I met her at the gate and walked her into my office, a plain room off the main bay, desk and 2 chairs, filing cabinets along the wall, a window facing the yard. I offered coffee. She accepted. We sat down. She opened with the railway notice, framed it as an administrative complication, something her office was already working to resolve. Her tone was measured, professional, and entirely controlled. I listened. Then she said, I want to be straightforward with you, Mr. Calloway. The town is committed to this project, but I also want to make sure you feel the process has been fair. I looked at her. What would fair look like to you? I asked. She began describing a revised valuation approach, a number closer to market rate, a timeline extension for my relocation. I nodded at each point and wrote nothing down, because fair was not what I was after anymore. She talked for about 20 minutes. I let her finish completely before I said anything. That is a discipline I learned from my father. He used to say that the person who speaks second in a tense conversation has all the information. The person who speaks first gives it away. Dren had given me quite a bit. She was worried about the timeline. That came through in how many times she referenced the grant deadline without ever naming it directly, 3 times in 20 minutes, always framed as the town's obligations or the project's momentum. She was also worried about the railway issue more than she would let on, because she would mentioned it at the start and then circled back to it near the end, which meant it was sitting heavy. What she had not mentioned, not once, was Drenfield Partners. When she finished, I said, I appreciate you coming out. I want to think carefully before I respond to any revised offer. Of course, she said. Take your time. One question, I said. The preferred development partner listed in the county planning file, Drenfield Partners. Can you tell me more about how they were selected? The shift was small, a slight stillness in her posture. A half-second before her next breath. They went through our standard RFP process, she said. Competitive submission. When was that process run? I would have to check the exact dates. The letter of intent in the file is dated about 8 months ago, I said. I was just curious about the timeline. She held my gaze. I can have my office send you the procurement documentation. That would be helpful, I said. She left shortly after. I walked her to the gate, shook her hand, watched the town vehicle pull out onto Birch Hollow Road and disappear. Then I went back inside and pulled up the recording on my phone. 14 days later, Judith filed 2 documents simultaneously. The first was a formal legal objection to the eminent domain proceedings, citing the 1974 railway agreement, Norfolk Southern's outstanding compliance notice, and procedural invalidity under state acquisition law. It was filed with the county court and copied to the town solicitor's office. The second was an ethics complaint filed with the State Municipal Ethics Commission. It documented Patricia Dren's ownership stake in Drenfield Partners LLC, her failure to disclose that interest in required municipal financial filings, and her active role as committee chair in initiating proceedings that would directly benefit her company. Every claim was sourced to public record. Incorporation documents, state registry filings, county planning files. The timeline was laid out chronologically, without editorializing. Judith was precise about that. No accusations beyond what the documents supported. No inflammatory language. Just facts, dated and sourced, arranged in a sequence that told its own story. We sent no press release. We called no journalists. We filed the papers and waited. The waiting is the part nobody tells you about. You build your case carefully. You file the right documents through the right channels. You do everything the correct way. And then you sit in your ordinary life, while bureaucratic processes grind forward at their own speed, indifferent to your timeline or your anxiety. I am not an anxious man by nature. But those first few weeks after filing were uncomfortable in a specific way, not because I doubted what we would done, but because I had no visibility into what was happening on the other side. I did not know what Dren knew, what she would told her colleagues, whether the ethics complaint had been acknowledged, whether the town solicitor had briefed the full council. I ran my business, moved freight, paid my people on Friday. The first signal came not from a lawyer or an official notice, but from a conversation at a hardware store. I was picking up supplies on a Saturday morning when a man named Gerald Toms stopped me in the fastener aisle. Gerald was a retired schoolteacher who attended every public meeting and knew everyone's business without being malicious about it. He was the human equivalent of a town newsletter. "Heard there has been some turbulence at the municipal building," he said, with the studied casualness of someone who absolutely wants to be asked a follow-up question. "That right," I said. "Council meeting got extended last week. Closed session after the public portion. Have not seen one of those in 3 or 4 years." He paused. "People are talking." "People always talk, Gerald." He smiled. "This time they might have something to talk about." I thanked him and finished my shopping. That same week, a brief item appeared in the regional paper, the Marin Crossing Courier, a modest publication that ran twice a week and covered local government with the dutiful thoroughness of a paper that knew its readership actually paid attention. The item was short, buried on page 4. "The Municipal Ethics Commission has confirmed receipt of a formal complaint regarding a member of the Marin Crossing Town Council. The Commission declined to identify the subject of the complaint or provide details, citing procedural confidentiality during the review period." 6 sentences. No names. But in a town of 11,000 people, 6 sentences was plenty. I read it with my morning coffee and said nothing to anyone. 2 days later, Kevin from Dren's office called again. His voice had changed from the last time, less rehearsed, more careful. "Councilwoman Dren wanted me to let you know the town is pausing active proceedings on the Birch Hollow acquisition pending review of some internal documentation." "I appreciate the update," I said. "She also wanted me to convey that she hopes the lines of communication remain open." "They are open," I said. "They have always been open." I hung up and looked out at the yard. The gravel was wet from overnight rain. The loading bays were quiet on a Wednesday morning. The rail spurs ran straight and rust-edged through the tree line, exactly as they always had. Nothing had changed visibly, but something had shifted, the way weight shifts before a structure gives way. 6 weeks after we filed, Judith called me on a Friday afternoon with a tone I had not heard from her before. Not excited, she was not that kind of lawyer, but focused in a way that meant something had moved. "The Ethics Commission has formally opened an investigation," she said. "They notified Dren directly. That is standard procedure once they have determined the complaint has sufficient basis to proceed." "What does that mean practically?" "It means they reviewed our filing and found enough documented substance to warrant a full inquiry. They will request records from the municipality, interview relevant parties, and issue a finding. That process takes 2 to 4 months typically." "And in the meantime?" In the meantime, the Commission notified the full town council of the investigation, which means every council member now knows there is a formal ethics inquiry into their committee chair." I let that sit for a moment. "How does the council typically respond to that?" "Depends on the council," Judith said. "Some close ranks, some distance themselves immediately. Given what is documented here, the undisclosed financial interest, the direct benefit relationship, I would expect at least some members to start asking hard questions internally." She was right. It took 11 days. The Courier ran a longer piece that time. Front page, below the fold. A staff reporter named Anna Reyes had clearly been working her sources. The headline read, "Council Member Faces Ethics Inquiry Amid Questions About Development Partnership." Reyes had done her own research. She would pulled the same incorporation records Claire had found, cross-referenced them against Dren's financial disclosure filings, and interviewed 2 council members on background. Neither would go on record, but the quotes made their discomfort clear. One described the situation as a serious concern that the full council needs to address. Dren issued a statement through a spokesperson. It was 3 paragraphs of careful language that essentially said she had always acted in the town's best interest and was cooperating fully with the review process. No denial of the LLC membership. No explanation of the disclosure gap. That absence was its own answer. I read the article twice. I had not spoken to Ana Reyes. I had not spoken to anyone in the press. Everything in her piece came from the same public records we would use. She would just found them independently once the ethics complaint became public knowledge. That was important to me. I had not tried to weaponize the media. The documents had done their own work once they were filed in the right places. My phone rang more that week than it had in years. Neighbors. A few clients who would heard. Gerald Toms, who did not even pretend to be casual this time. I kept every conversation short. I was pursuing the matter through proper channels. I had nothing further to add. Thank you for your concern. On Thursday of that week, I got a call from a number I did not recognize. Charlotte area code. It was Teresa Wan. Mr. Calloway, I wanted to let you know Norfolk Southern has received a response from the municipality regarding our compliance notice. What did they say? They have requested a 90-day extension to develop an alternative rerouting proposal. A pause. We are declining the extension as filed. 60 days is the standard window, and they have already used 30 of it. 30 days left on their clock. The 30 days passed without a viable rerouting proposal. I know this because Teresa called me again on day 32. Norfolk Southern had reviewed what the town submitted, a preliminary assessment document, 40 pages, largely theoretical, and determined it did not meet the standard for an approved alternative routing plan. The railway issued a formal non-compliance notice to the municipality. In practical terms, this meant the town could not proceed with any acquisition or development action on my property without being in active breach of a federal rail operations agreement. The grant deadline was now 5 months away. Even if the ethics inquiry resolved quickly and somehow found no wrongdoing, which was looking increasingly unlikely, the town had no realistic path to completing the acquisition, transferring development rights, breaking ground, and satisfying grant conditions in 5 months. Not with a railway compliance problem sitting on top of everything else. The math did not work anymore. Judith explained it to me the way she explained most things, plainly and without drama. The project is functionally dead, she said. They may not announce that publicly for some time. But the internal calculus has changed. No rational actor pushes forward from this position. What about Dren? Her situation is separate from the project now. The ethics inquiry proceeds, regardless of what happens with the development plan. She has her own problem to manage. 3 weeks later, a special council meeting was called. Not a regular Tuesday session, a special meeting, noticed on a Wednesday, scheduled for the following Monday. The agenda listed one item: Review and reconsideration of Eastern Corridor Revitalization Initiative. I did not attend. Judith did, as an observer. She called me that evening. The council had voted 4-1 to suspend the Eastern Corridor Initiative pending the ethics investigation outcome and resolution of the outstanding railway compliance issues. The lone vote against suspension was Dren herself. She would argued the project was still viable and the complications were manageable. Her 4 colleagues had looked at the same situation and reached a different conclusion. How did she seem? I asked. I do not know exactly why I asked that. Judith considered it. Composed, but isolated. Nobody on that council was looking at her the way colleagues look at each other. I understood what that meant. In a small municipal body, that kind of social distance is its own verdict before any formal one arrives. The Courier covered the meeting. Ana Reyes' piece ran the next morning. The suspension was framed neutrally, but the context was clear. A project that had been presented as the town's signature infrastructure initiative had collapsed under the weight of a compliance failure and an ethics investigation into its primary champion. I read the article at my kitchen table. Same table where I would open the eminent domain letter 7 months earlier. Same overhead light. Different feeling entirely. My property was mine. Still mine. Exactly as it had always been. That felt less like victory than like restoration. Like something had been briefly disturbed and then settled back into its correct position. The Ethics Commission issued its finding 4 months after opening the investigation. I read the summary Judith sent me on a quiet Tuesday morning. 14 pages. Dense, careful language. The kind of document that takes bureaucratic months to produce and 10 minutes to read if you know what you are looking for. The finding was clear. Patricia Drenn had violated the state's municipal ethics code by failing to disclose her ownership interest in Drenfield Partners LLC, while serving as chair of the Land Use Committee and actively directing proceedings that would have financially benefited that company. The Commission found the omission was not accidental. The disclosure requirement was explicit. The timeline of events showed she had been a managing member of Drenfield for over a year before initiating the acquisition process, and the letter of intent between the town and Drenfield had been submitted during a period when her disclosure forms made no reference to the LLC. The Commission's language for that kind of gap was deliberate non-disclosure. The recommended sanctions were removal from the Land Use Committee, a formal public censure entered into the municipal record, and a referral to the county prosecutor's office for review of potential statutory violations. That last part was not the Commission's decision to make. They referred. The prosecutor would determine whether to act. I called Judith after I finished reading. "What happens now?" I asked. "The council votes on implementing the Commission's recommended sanctions. That is largely procedural at this point. Very few councils reject an ethics commission finding." She paused. "The prosecutor referral is the open question. That process is independent and moves on its own timeline." "Will she resign?" "I do not know. Some people do at this stage. Some fight it. Depends on her read of the situation and her appetite for continued exposure." Drenn resigned 12 days later. The statement was brief. She cited personal reasons and thanked the community for the opportunity to serve. No acknowledgement of the ethics finding. No reference to the development project. 3 paragraphs that said everything through what they did not say. I did not feel satisfaction reading it. I want to be honest about that, because satisfaction would imply I would wanted this outcome, specifically her resignation, her public diminishment. I had not wanted that. I would wanted my property. I would wanted the process, to be honest. Those things had required addressing what she would done, but they were not the same as wanting to see her fall. She would made her own choices. The consequences were the arithmetic of those choices, not anything I would designed. Gerald Toms called me the afternoon the resignation was announced. "Well," he said. "Well," I agreed, "you handled that quietly." "Nothing to handle loudly," I said. He laughed a little. "People noticed, Dale, that is all I will say." I thanked him and got off the phone. Outside, the yard was running normally. A delivery was staging in Bay 2. One of my loaders was doing a pre-shift check on the forklift. The rail spurs caught the afternoon light the way they always did, dull metal against pale gravel, unremarkable, unless you knew what they meant. The county prosecutor had 30 days to respond to the Commission's referral. That clock was still running. The prosecutor took 26 of her 30 days. Her office issued a brief statement confirming they had reviewed the Ethics Commission referral and were opening a formal inquiry into potential violations of state statutes governing official misconduct and misuse of public office. They named no individuals publicly, standard practice at inquiry stage. But in Maron Crossing, with one ethics finding already in the public record, there was only one person the statement could refer to. Anna Reyes covered it in the Courier. Short piece. Factual, no speculation. She would become the de facto recorder of this entire sequence, not because anyone had fed her information, but because she was paying attention and doing her job. I had never spoken to her directly. That changed on a Thursday afternoon when she called my office number. I almost did not answer. I am not someone who seeks press attention, and everything to this point had proceeded without it. But I picked up. She introduced herself, acknowledged she would been covering the story, and asked if I was willing to speak on the record. She was straightforward about it, no ambush framing, no leading questions in the introduction. Just a direct ask. I thought about it for a moment. "I will speak with you," I said, "but I want to be clear about what I will discuss. The property situation and the process I followed. Nothing about Miss Drenn personally, nothing about the prosecutor's inquiry." "That is fair," Reyes said. We met the following afternoon at my office. She was younger than I would expected, late 20s, notebook and pen, no recorder that I could see. She asked good questions, not sensational ones. She wanted to understand the timeline, the railway agreement, how I would learn about Drenfield Partners, why I would chosen to go through formal channels rather than, as she put it, taking a more public approach early on. That last question I thought about before answering. Because loud does not mean effective, I said. I had a real problem that needed a real solution. The railway agreement was a legal fact. The ethics violation was documented in public records. Those things had weight on their own. If I would gone to the press first, I would have been a man with accusations. Going through the proper channels first meant that by the time anything became public, it was not my word against anyone's, it was a documented record. She wrote that down. Were you ever worried it would not work? She asked. Honest question. I gave her an honest answer. There were weeks where I had no visibility into what was happening, I said. You file things and then you wait. That is uncomfortable. But the facts were solid. I kept coming back to that. The piece ran the following Tuesday. It was longer than her previous coverage, a feature, not a news brief. She would reconstructed the timeline carefully, explained the railway agreement in terms a general reader could follow, and quoted me accurately. The headline was straightforward. Maron Crossing business owner kept his property, and the paper trail did the work. I read it once, put it down, and went out to the yard. The prosecutor's inquiry ran for 7 months. I will not pretend I tracked every development closely during that period. Life continued. The business ran. Winter came and went. The Eastern Rail junction went down twice for maintenance and freight rerouted through my spurs both times, exactly as the agreement specified, quiet, functional, unremarkable. The way infrastructure is supposed to work. Marcus Holt, the other managing member of Drenfield Partners, dissolved the LLC 4 months into the inquiry. No announcement. It simply disappeared from the State Business Registry. Claire found it when I asked her to check. The town council appointed an interim committee chair for land use matters, a man named Paul Garrett, who had a background in civil engineering and a reputation for reading documents carefully before signing them. Early indicators suggested he was exactly that. 3 of my neighbors on the Eastern Corridor, whose properties had also been listed in the development plan, though a secondary acquisition, sent me notes of thanks. 2 handwritten, 1 email. I appreciated them without knowing quite what to do with them. I had not set out to protect their properties. I would set out to protect mine. That the process had consequences beyond my parcel was not something I would engineered. It was just what happened when you fixed a problem correctly. In the 9th month after the ethics finding, the prosecutor's office announced charges: official misconduct, misuse of public office, and a 3rd charge relating to filing false or incomplete financial disclosures as a public official. 3 counts total. I read the announcement on my phone standing next to the forklift in Bay 3. My loader, a man named Pete who would worked for me 11 years, looked over. Everything okay? Fine, I said. Just reading something. He nodded and went back to work. That was the entirety of my reaction in that moment. Not celebration. Not relief exactly. Just a quiet recognition that the process had completed what it was designed to do. Judith called that afternoon. She was precise as always. The charges are consistent with what the evidence supported, she said. Her legal team will likely contest, so this moves into a longer timeline now. But from your perspective, Dale, everything relevant to your property situation resolved months ago. I know. I want to make sure you understand that what happens next in the criminal process has no bearing on your standing. Your property is clear. The acquisition proceedings were formally abandoned. The railway agreement is intact. You are in exactly the position you should have been in from the beginning. I know, I said again, and I did know. I would known it for months. The charges were the end of Dren's story, not mine. My story had effectively ended the day the town council voted to suspend the development initiative. Everything after that was resolution, not revelation. What I had not fully articulated to myself until that phone call was something simpler. I would opened a letter on a Thursday morning and felt my life was about to be taken from me, and I would gotten it back, not through luck, not through connections or money or the right last name, through records that existed, an agreement my father had signed, and a willingness to move carefully through the correct channels. That felt worth understanding. About a year after all of this settled, I did something I had not done in a long time. I walked the full perimeter of the property. Not for any practical reason. I did not need to inspect the fence line or check the drainage on the north edge. I just wanted to walk it. 14 acres takes about 40 minutes at a comfortable pace if you go the long way, which I did. It was an October morning, cold and clear, the kind of day where the light sits low and everything casts a long shadow. The gravel yard was quiet. The loading bays were locked. I walked the west edge first, along the tree line, then south past the old timber boundary markers my grandfather had installed in the 60s, iron stakes, still upright, still legible, if you knew what you were reading. I thought about Edwin Calloway buying this land from a failed timber company 61 years ago. He had not bought it for its beauty. He would bought it because it was flat and accessible and had 2 rail spurs nobody else wanted. Practical man. Unsentimental. He saw function where other people saw inconvenience. My father had been the same way. He would renewed the railway agreement twice, not because it was profitable on its own terms, but because he believed in maintaining what was useful. You keep things in good order, he used to say, and the value shows up when you need it. The value had shown up. I reached the eastern spur on the back end of my walk, stood where I would stood the morning I read the eminent domain letter. The tracks ran straight toward the tree line, rust-edged and solid. A year ago I would stood in this exact spot and thought about what those spurs meant, the distinction I would recognize that Patricia Dren had not. The fact that my property was not simply 14 acres of gravel. It was a piece of functioning infrastructure with legal weight and institutional relationships attached. That distinction had saved everything. I do not tell this story to make myself sound clever. I tell it because the lesson is not really about cleverness. I did not outmaneuver anyone. I read a document carefully. I made phone calls to people who knew more than I did. I found a lawyer who understood the terrain. I let the process work. The cleverness, if there was any, belonged to my father and his father before him, men who had built something real and maintained it honestly for 60 years, so that when the moment came, there was something solid to stand on. I walked back across the yard as the sun cleared the tree line. Pete arrived in his truck as I was finishing, lifted a hand in greeting, started his pre-shift check without being asked. Normal morning, ordinary Tuesday. The freight comes in, the freight goes out. The spurs connect the main line 2 miles north. The agreement sits in a filing cabinet and in Norfolk Southern's registry, doing its quiet work. The town is building something on the eastern corridor eventually. Different developer. Different committee chair. Different plan, smaller, more practical, on parcels whose owners agreed to sell. None of it touches my land. There is a thing that happens when you go through a fight like this and come out the other side. People want to make it bigger than it was. Gerald Toms told anyone who would listen that I would outplay the entire town council. A few neighbors treated me like I would done something heroic. One man I barely knew stopped me at the gas station and said, "Heard you took on the system and won," with the kind of admiration usually reserved for people who do something genuinely difficult. I understood the impulse. But it sat uncomfortably with me, because it was not accurate. I had not taken on the system. I would use the system, the actual, functioning, legitimate version of it. The railway agreement was real. The ethics disclosure requirement was real. The commission process was real. The county planning records were public for exactly the reason I would use them. None of it was a loophole or a trick. It was infrastructure, legal and administrative, built over decades for precisely these situations. What I would done was pay attention. That sounds like false modesty. It is not. Paying attention carefully, patiently, without letting anger push you into bad decisions, is genuinely hard when something you have built over 20 years is being taken from you. The morning I read that letter, my first instinct was not to call Roland or pull the railway agreement. My first instinct was to drive to the municipal building and make my displeasure loudly known. I did not do that. Not because I am especially wise, but because I would watched enough situations go wrong to know that loud does not protect anything. The thing I keep coming back to, the thing I would want anyone in a similar situation to understand, is this: the documents matter more than the drama. Your grandfather's agreement, your property records, your chain of title, the easements and covenants and third-party relationships attached to your land, those things have weight that your anger never will. Know what you own. Know what is attached to it. Keep the paperwork in order. My father used to say that a property is only as strong as its documentation. I thought he was being tedious when he said it. I was wrong. The other thing, the harder thing, is patience. The willingness to let a slow process run its course rather than forcing a faster, louder resolution. Judith was right that the facts were solid. But solid facts still have to travel through the correct channels at the correct speed. Trying to accelerate that out of frustration usually damages the case. I waited. Things resolved. It is not a satisfying formula, but it is the honest one. The eastern corridor of Maron Crossing looks mostly the same as it did 2 years ago. My yard looks exactly the same. Gravel, sheds, loading bays, 2 rail spurs running toward the tree line. Unremarkable unless you know the story. Which, now, you do. I want to tell you about one more moment. A small one. Easy to miss if you were not paying attention. It happened about 3 weeks after the prosecutor announced the charges against Dren. I was at the county records office routine visit, nothing related to any of this, and I ran into a young woman in the hallway outside the planning department, mid-20s, carrying a folder, looking slightly lost. She asked me if I knew where the property records window was. I pointed her down the hall. She thanked me and started walking, then turned back. "Are you Dale Calloway?" she asked. "I am." She nodded like something had confirmed itself. I read the article, in the Courier. A pause. I am dealing with something similar. Not exactly the same, but a municipality trying to push me off a property my family has owned since the 80s. I did not know where to start. I looked at her for a moment. "Start here," I said. "This office. Pull everything filed on your property. Survey records, easements, any third-party agreements. Read all of it. Even the old stuff? Especially the old stuff." She wrote something in her phone. "Then what?" "Find out if anything attached to your property involves a party other than the municipality, a utility company, a railway, a water authority, anyone with an independent legal interest. That is your first question." She nodded, writing. "Then find a lawyer who used to work in municipal government. Not just a real estate attorney, someone who understands how these processes work from the inside." "And if none of that applies?" she asked. "If it is just the land and nothing else?" "Then you document everything, file through the correct channels, and you are patient. The process is slow, but it has teeth if you use it right." She thanked me. I wished her well and meant it. I do not know what happened with her situation. I never saw her again. Maybe her case was simpler than mine, or more complicated. Maybe she found the right lawyer and the right document. Maybe she did not. But I have thought about that conversation more than most of the larger moments in this story, more than filing the ethics complaint, more than the council vote, more than reading the prosecutor's announcement. Because that is what it finally comes down to for me. Not the victory, not the vindication. Just the idea that knowing the right things, the practical, unglamorous, document-reading things, can be the difference between keeping what is yours and losing it forever. And that if you have been through it once, the least you can do is pass that knowledge down the hall to the next person who needs it. Edwin Calloway bought this land from a failed company 61 years ago and saw something worth preserving. I'm just trying to do the same. I still open the filing cabinet sometimes. Not looking for anything specific. Just checking. The 1974 agreement sits in the second drawer, third folder from the left, exactly where it has always been. 14 pages, yellowed at the edges, signed by men who could not have known what those signatures would eventually protect. I think about what would have happened if my father had not renewed it in '89 and again in 2003. If he would let it lapse, decided it was not worth the administrative bother, figured the spurs were enough of a fixture that a formal agreement was redundant, the town would have acquired my property. Drenfield Partners would have broken ground. 14 acres of gravel and sheds and 60 years of family work would have become a mixed-use development with green spaces and a pedestrian path, and I would have been relocated somewhere smaller with a check that did not cover what I would lost. All of it, every phone call, every filed document, every procedural freeze rested on 14 pages my father had kept current because he believed in maintaining what was useful. I believe that too now, with the kind of conviction that only comes from having needed something and finding it exactly where it was supposed to be. The business runs. Pete arrives every morning and does his pre-shift check without being asked. The freight comes in and goes out. The Eastern Junction goes down a few times a year, and the Spurs do their quiet work, the way they have for decades. Maron Crossing is building its Eastern Corridor project without my land. Smaller scope, willing sellers, no eminent domain required. I hear it is going reasonably well. I have no feelings about it either way. Patricia Dren's case is still moving through the legal system. These things take time. I do not follow it closely. It stopped being my story a long time ago. My story ended the way it began, with a piece of ground and the paperwork that belongs to it. Some people fight for what is theirs with noise and pressure and the force of their anger. I understand that impulse. There are situations where it is the right tool. This was not one of them. I fought with a filing cabinet, a phone, and the patience to let the correct processes run at their correct speed. I won nothing I had not already owned. I recovered nothing I had not already earned. But I kept it. In the end, that is the whole story. You build something real. You maintain it honestly. You keep the paperwork in order. And when someone comes for it, because sometimes someone will, you open the filing cabinet and you show them what is there. The trains still run through this town. They run through my yard first. That is not a coincidence. That is 61 years of deliberate, unglamorous, document-by-document work. And it is mine.